Welcome back for more physiology. This particular talk, we're going to deal with muscle control, and in particular, how can we control muscle contraction? How can we vary their contractions? So a bit of review. What we're going to have is a motor neuron, which is going to fire an action potential. So we're going to have depolarization, repolarization, sodium coming in, potassium leaving, moving on down the axon until we reach the end of the axon, which case during a depolarization, calcium ions move into the axonal terminus. That's going to cause synaptic vesicles to move and release their contents into the synapse. In this particular case, we're going to have acetylcholine going from the presynaptic membrane into the synapse, binding to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, which will be a skeletal muscle. When they bind, it's going to trigger the release of sodium gate or sodium ions, so sodium will flood in. We're going to have another depolarization, bring it that wave of depolarization spreading over the over the skeletal muscle. What it will do eventually is reach these things that we call T-tubules, where it's going to dive on down through the T-tubules. Next to the T-tubules, there turn out to be big vats of calcium in the form of a sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the endoplasmic reticulum of a muscle cell. As the depolarization moves past the SR, it's going to open up calcium voltage gates, let calcium ions out. Calcium ions are going to bind to the thin filament of the sarcomere, which is the contractile unit of a skeletal muscle. When it binds to the thin filament, it's going to allow for the formation of a cross bridge. Cross bridge is when actin and myosin, the thin and the thick filaments, touch each other. The moment they touch, it's going to cause a power stroke or an immediate contraction, and that's going to make the ends of the sarcomere, the Z lines, get a little bit shorter. In order to reset this, we add ATP. ATP will break the cross bridge, reset it so that it can reattach and shorten again. We'll add ATP, shortens again. Add ATP, shortens again. Add ATP, shortens again. This cycle will continue until we run out of ATP, calcium, or neurotransmitter. That's the story so far. Where we go from here is, let's see if we can control it. Step number one is not all muscles contract the same way, and that's going to be because not all muscles have the same number of, or not all neurons connect to the same number of muscle cells. We call that union of a neuron to a group of muscle cells a motor unit. Motor units are either going to be large or small. Small motor units, so fine motor skills, are going to result in very few muscle cells per neuron. So to control the muscles, we need a lot more nerves. If I'm going to have a large motor function, so gross movement, not really fine and defined, that's going to be one neuron for many, many muscle cells. That's going to be like comparing your fingers, small motor unit, to wiggling your toes, a large motor unit. When I make these muscles contract, what I can notice is I can make them vary in their strength. And we call that varying of strength a summation. So what I can do is I can use my strength to pick up a water bottle and not crush it, or I can crush it. I can vary how much I'm using the muscle. That increase in muscular strength is referred to as summation, and it always has a maximum point, and that's going to depend on the number of muscle cells and the muscular size of each cell. But that top is referred to as tetanus. Tetanus that is unfused is shaking. So if you're using maximum effort, you shake when you use your muscles. If for some odd reason you were to fuse it all together and it stops that wavering motion, we call that complete or fused tetanus. That is what actually occurs when we have the disease tetanus. Your muscles actually lock in place, and for the most part, they don't let up. That summation turns out to be the exact opposite than what we see in neurons. Neurons never add up. A depolarization is a depolarization. There is no big, there's no small. We can't make them more intense or less intense. They just are. This is in stark contrast with muscles, which can increase and decrease in their size. Neurons can't, muscles can. When we look at the control of muscles, we actually can find it originating inside of the brain. In particular, what we call the pre-cortex or the premotor cortex or the motor cortex, which is going to be the portion of your brain, in particular your parietal lobe, that actually controls motor function. If I were to look at it, I can actually map out what I see in that section, and it creates this image that's referred to as a homunculus. And what this shows you is what portion of your brain is devoted to each part of your body. The more it turns out to have its own unique little set, the more control you have over it. So you notice your hand has a big chunk, especially compared to your body. Your hand kind of is given enough piece that kind of matches like your legs and your knees and your thighs and your feet. It's almost the same amount of size, which tells you how much more control your body or your brain devotes to your hands than it does to your entire lower limb. You'll notice that your tongue is out by itself, and that's because you have amazing control of your tongue. You can find anything inside of your mouth, and it lets you speak. One of the other things that we have to do in order to control these muscles, outside of we can vary their strength and we have different parts of your body devoting different amounts of motor units, is we have them functioning in what we call antagonistic pairs, meaning muscles actually act in tandem. They act in opposites. So if you had to lift something up, you can either lift it straight up. The problem is you won't have much control over the lift, because if it bounces, you don't get much say in it. But if you had two strings and you can control the up and the down, what you will notice is you'll get a much smoother control. You'll get a much smoother motion. And that's because antagonistic pairs working in opposites allows for better control. We give lots of words for this antagonistic pair phenomenon, and we'll deal with all those words later. You could look them up and define them yourself. They all deal with joints, meaning whenever you have two bones that touch each other, that articulation or joint is where the words show up. The muscle itself does not undergo flexion. The elbow, however, does undergo flexion and extension, because that's where the actual action is. All of this manifests itself in what we would refer to as a reflex. Reflexes are a basic survival technique that we have that involves 5 parts. We have a receptor, we have what we call a sensory neuron, an interneuron, the motor neuron, and the effector, which is typically going to be a muscle. A lot of the ones that we test are going to involve stretch. Reason why we like to test these things is there's a lot of things that can go wrong with your muscles. In particular, there's a very horrible disorder referred to as muscular dystrophy, which is where the muscle isn't built right, and the result is paralysis. Lots of things can go wrong with us controlling our muscles, so we have a lot of tests devised to make sure that our muscles are actually working.